Hey everybody, welcome to Truth Be Told. Thanks very much for being here to study the Bible with me. I really appreciate it, and I hope you find today's episode interesting. It kind of relates to a story that a lot of people find very approachable and interesting, and it also connects the Old and New Testaments, which is one of my all-time favorite things. So I found this really interesting, and I hope you do as well. You know, sometimes it's not like some grand, in-depth revelation that just shakes everything you've understood about Scripture and puts a whole new spin on everything. Sometimes you study the Bible, I'd say many times you study the Bible, and you're just left with something that's like, wow, that was pretty cool. That's kind of what today's episode is. It's not high stakes or anything. I'm not trying to entrap you with some BuzzFeed title. This is just something I thought was cool and that I thought you would find interesting as well. And it does relate to the story of the woman at the well that so many people find relatable, and I think they just see Jesus as approachable in this story. He just interacts with this woman in a very interesting way that I think we all appreciate. We learn something about Jesus' character in this interaction in a way that I don't think we get in a lot of other stories. So I think that's really cool. It's got wide appeal for people. But personally, I love when I see parallels between the Old and New Testaments. I love the study of typology. I love symbolism. I love foreshadowing. I love when the authors are using intentional wordplay and repetition of phrases that you find in other stories and other books to draw your attention to certain things. And I think when I talk about this stuff, even though I find it interesting, I find it amazing how God can inspire stories to be written in a way that draw your attention backwards and forwards and make you expect certain things. And I love that God does that, and that the people he called were in many ways just genius writers to do this. But the problem is, when I say things like the authors of the Bible had a certain literary license to write the story in a way that provoked certain thoughts in you, I think people hear that word literary license, or that combination of words, I should say, and they hear, or they think I'm saying something like when you watch a movie that says at the beginning, these events are loosely based on history or whatever, and you're just like, yeah, but how much of it was accurate, you know? And I think it gives off this sense that, like, what I'm saying is that the Bible is just a story that was written down specifically to invoke a certain thought pattern or like make you feel a certain thing, and that nothing really happened. It's all allegory, or it's all just storytelling to convey a point. And some people do take that lean with the Bible. They'll say, well, it's a lot more metaphorical. It's a lot more mythological. And I think especially in the Western world, we have a real problem with this because we are very empirically minded. We want to know, did something happen or didn't it happen? Not just, is it true or not? Is the lesson true? Is there truth to be drawn from it? We want to know that something is historically and empirically, factually correct, and that it was written down that way. I don't think that the Eastern thinkers, like the Hebraic thinkers, the Greek thinkers, had some of these hang-ups, but I also don't think that they just made up information for the sake of making a story fit. I believe that when I see parallels between the Old and New Testaments and they just work out so perfectly, I think it's a combination of various authors having the wherewithal, the foresight, and the vision themselves to say, there's something important here. There's something about their perspective latched onto something that they believed needed written down. It's kind of like when, if you or I were to go to the exact same place, let's say we went to the zoo, and we went through the zoo together, walked step for step along the same path, and left the zoo, and someone said, well, what happened today? How'd your day go? I might talk about all the animals that we saw. You know, I might be very much more animal-minded. Like, I'm at the zoo to see animals, and so we saw this, and then this, and then this. You might be more interested in the conversation. Maybe you don't like zoos all that much, but you had a good time hanging out with me. I hope. I guess that's kind of presumptuous to say, but you know, you had a good time and you remember the conversation, so you tell the story from that lens. Both stories are true. Both stories can be empirically, factually, historically correct and accurate, but it doesn't mean that they're not different in some way. When you tell that story, you have the license to tell it through your perspective, and sometimes you're going to highlight things that I don't, and I'm going to highlight things that you don't. I think that this happens in the Bible all the time, especially in the Gospels where we see accounts compared to each other. But I think across the Old and New Testaments, we also see this where you see something that kind of foreshadows something else. And when it's fulfilled, you could say, man, that fits so perfectly, Micah, that I think when you say that they're the same thing, it makes me think that one of them had to be made up in order to try and trick us into thinking it fits so perfectly. Like maybe an author wrote something down that wasn't entirely true, but it fit the pattern that you're drawing out. I don't think that's happening. I believe in God's ability to work in the lives of people, to inspire writing in a way that brings out these patterns, that highlights certain things. This is a crazy long monologue. I've talked about this in a lot of videos, but I just want to give that caveat for people that hear some of these parallels that I give between the Old and New Testaments and may have some skepticism. I am not saying at all that these things factually did not happen. I am saying that God is a master writer and that he chose people with the ability to write and to notice and to draw out some important things from stories and then record them in ways that you can see again and again and again. And I think that's an amazing thing all on its own. But let's go real quick to John chapter 4, because that is the story of the woman from Samaria who Jesus meets at the well. And it's a very interesting story. The Samaritans were a people that Israel could not stand. They were people from foreign nations that came in and lived in the land. They saw them as like occupiers that never left. And worse than that, they married into Israelite and Jewish families in some cases and kind of muddied the water of religion and of even like tribal bloodlines, which were important to the Israelite people. So Israel did not look at the Samaritans favorably at all. And Jesus fairly regularly shows them some level of respect. Not to say that they are perfect people, not to say they are like God's chosen in some way, but he does say that the word of God, the gospel message, is supposed to go out to Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Like, it's supposed to go out. And so he includes the Samaritans, and a lot of times he speaks with the Jews, I think specifically because to the Jews, that would have been one of the hardest things to get over, that the Samaritans are going to be brought in. Okay, fine. I could see like a well-meaning Greek person coming to synagogue and giving up his life and, really converting to my way of thinking. But the Samaritans, it didn't matter what they did right. There was this feud going on for hundreds and hundreds of years that to a Jewish person who is now following Christ, to be told, go and share that good news with a Samaritan, that they are also included, that would have just been nearly impossible. So I think Jesus intentionally steps into that tension regularly. But this is what we see when Jesus meets this woman at the well. You have to remember all that context to know why the disciples were so amazed at what was happening. In verse 7 of chapter 4, it says, "A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink,' for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.' Jesus answered her, 'If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water.'" So we know from later accounts this living water is access to the Spirit of God. This is an invitation for this woman that she can't quite understand, but she's very intrigued by what Jesus is saying here. And he's going to correct her thinking, explaining that it is not just physical water. It's not just a well that has a river underneath it that's flowing and moving. This is something deeper. This is something spiritual. And the woman eventually, is so intrigued with Jesus that she's sitting there for a long time talking with him about this. And Jesus says to her, kind of stops her in the middle of this conversation. He says, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." And this woman is floored at this because this is exactly, apparently, her life scenario. Now that's where I want to stop, because I do want to go back to the Old Testament and show you something really, really interesting. For all of the maybe limited understanding that many people have about the Samaritans in the New Testament, I think many mainstream Christians would be surprised to know that the Samaritans are discussed in the Old Testament. Their formation is outlined. Like, we know exactly where they come from. We know exactly who they are. We know exactly how they got in the land. For people that stick only to the New Testament, they would miss all of this. And I know I just explained some of the context, but just let's go through it in the Old Testament to show you that this is not a mystery. They don't just appear on the scene in the New Testament as a hated people group. They were formed, and they do have a history. So Israel, the northern 10 tribes, are going into captivity. God has allowed Assyria to come in, take them captive, and scatter them throughout the rest of the nations. And what Assyria does is very interesting. It says this in verse 24 of 2 Kings 17. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. So Israel gets scattered. They go out to all the other nations. And then Assyria, to consolidate power, takes members of the other nations and scatters them as well. So he's going to bring a mixed group of people. So nobody can organize. They kind of lose their national identity in a way. He's going to force these melting pots all over his nation, the king of Assyria is, and his kingdom. That way, they remain the strongest people group in the land. So he brings people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim into Samaria. And what happens next is really weird. It says, like, all these people in Samaria begin worshiping their own gods in the land of Israel, within the confines of Israel. It says they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So then the king is told that this is going on, and he says, well, what are we supposed to do? And he says, maybe the God of that land is upset. So he brings back some priests of Israel and says, teach the people how to obey the God here, because this is becoming too chaotic. We got lions coming in and killing people. They're not safe. We need to appease this God. So the priests come in and they work with the people that are now inhabiting this region, and they teach them God's ways. In verse 29, it says, but every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities in which they lived. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth made Nergal, the men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nebaz and Tartak, and the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anemelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord, and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. So now we have this really weird mixed people group. And the Israelites, in some part, are still there. There are Israelites that were born in the land that do worship God, but we have all these other people groups coming in and bringing in their own gods. So not only do we have a mix of nationalities and ethnicities and cultures, we have a mix of religions happening, where God is kind of becoming one among this really eclectic pantheon of gods, and all of them are being worshipped. And it's a problem. It's messy, but it's interesting that God allows this to go on. In fact, he brings some of his own people back. He kind of instigates this moment where the king of Assyria brings back priests to teach the people. So there's some remnant of truth left. But the really interesting part, the thing that I'm hoping you haven't gotten to it yet, from just what we've read so far, the really interesting part is how this story in the book of 2 Kings 17 mirrors the story of the woman at the well. You'll remember that Jesus said, bring your husband. And she said, I have no husband. He said, you've answered correctly. You don't have a husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now isn't even your husband. When the king of Assyria brought people into the land of Israel, and they merged this foreign pagan practice with their God worship, the nations were Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. 5 distinct people with 5 distinct sets of beliefs came into the land of Israel and committed spiritual adultery with the people of Israel. This is what's happening. It's almost like Israel has had 5 husbands, and the one that they're with now is still not their husband. So when Jesus meets the woman at the well, which is a very common theme all throughout the Old Testament, where patriarchs come into a land and they meet a woman at the well, and they are that woman's husband. They're destined to be that woman's husband. They're destined to be at least they should be. If anyone meets them at the well and doesn't protect them, doesn't reach out to them, doesn't form a relationship with them, it's typically that character's not a good guy. But we got so many characters. Moses meets Zipporah at the well. Jacob meets Rachel at the well. This keeps on happening throughout the Old Testament, where the woman comes to the well and meets her husband. And Jesus is saying, go and call your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. I'm not even married to these people. I've just been living with them. I've just had relations with them. He says, yeah, I know this. But it's not in condemnation in a really weird way. It's absolutely calling her away from that. It's recognizing that at least she told the truth about her situation in some way. But it's also saying, in a picturesque kind of way, that Jesus is the husband. He is the one that she's supposed to be wed to. He's kind of calling back those Israelite roots that she had from the beginning. And he's saying, even though you've been adulterous with these 5 other men, or these 5 other nations in the case of Samaria as a people group, I am your true husband. I'm presenting myself to you. And I think that is an amazing thing. Adultery and idolatry go hand in hand throughout the Old Testament as well. I believe this is a parallel that is intentionally happening, but I also believe that it's true that 5 nations were sent into Israel. I also believe that this woman potentially had 5 different partners in her lifetime. I believe these things can be factually and historically and empirically true, but I also believe that God can coordinate events so that real life events parallel one another in amazing ways to point to something even greater. Jesus as the husband, bringing his bride back, who's been under subjection to these foreign gods. I just think that's a beautiful thing. It's really cool. And I hope you enjoyed that. This was a lot longer than I thought it was. I thought it was going to be a lot shorter, but getting into the context of the Samaritans and everything just took a little bit longer than I thought. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. I really love when the Bible does things like this, just gives us these parallels. And I hope you find that interesting as well. And maybe it's something you look out for as you read the New Testament in light of the Old Testament.